Hello, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today that will be focused on anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and we have a very special guest. Many of you know her, Sarah Hurwitz. So just to introduce we're going to get started right away. So a few things. My name is Yair Lev, and I'm from the Philadelphia area. I'm a local community manager for AIDS Coalition. And I work with other organizations as well, including the American Jewish Medical Association. And, this is such an important topic now because we see anti-Semitism in healthcare, in workplaces, K-12, campuses, universities, and it's not getting better even after the war has ended. And speaking about the war that has ended, I do think that we need to mention and remember Ron Gvili and his family members who are, still waiting for him to come back. Unfortunately, he died or was murdered by the Hamas, and we really want him back as soon as possible. So thank you again for all of you for being with us. And before we get started, if everybody can, while everybody's logging in, please try to let us in the chat below where you are Zooming from, which state, which country you're from. And I'll just say a couple of words about AIDS Coalition. So for those who are joining us for the first time, AIDS Coalition is a United States non-for-profit organization. And its mission is really to strengthen and preserve the democratic foundation of the State of Israel. And you'll see throughout the conversation in the chat messages below. So with more information about the organization, please check it out, the link in the bottom. So with that, I'm really honored to introduce our guest today. And this is Sarah Hurwitz. And many of you know her and read her books and maybe heard her in podcasts. She is the author of a recent book, As a Jew, Reclaiming Our Story from Those Who Shame, Blame, and Try to Erase Us. And it's a New York Times bestsellers. And another book from a few years ago, Here All Along, Finding the Meaning, Spirituality, and a Deeper Connection to Life in Judaism. So she was, if you don't know, she was the White House speechwriter for almost a decade, from 2009 until 2017. And she started as a senior speechwriter for President Barack Obama, and then she was serving as the head speechwriter for the First Lady, Michelle Obama. And then before she was working in the White House, she was also the chief speechwriter for Hillary Clinton in 2008 through her presidential campaign. Sarah Hurwitz is a graduate of the Harvard College and Harvard Law School, and she has completed her training to be also a chaplain, which she does on volunteer basis at hospital near her home. So welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much. I'm thrilled to be here today, really. And thanks to all of you for joining and taking time on a Sunday to join us. It really means a lot.
And before we get started, I'll just mention to the audience, please pay attention. Note the audience basically chats or messages below. And remember, this is going to be, as always, a conversation, a stimulating, interesting conversation. And we will absolutely have time for questions. So later on, the chat will be closed, but you'll see in the bottom of the screen, there's an option of Q&A. So that is where everybody, if you have technical questions, but mostly questions for us, and it's going to be, there's a lot of people on this webinar. I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get to all of them, but we're going to try our best. So just maybe, Sarah, as an introduction, again, thank you for joining us. And, we're thinking about, you've spent a lot of time in the White House and, immersed with politics and all the figures who work and live and were presidents. And the White House, you were basically a speechwriter, and then that kind of led you to writing a book about the Judaism, and then the second book, and you wrote another book about the second one about anti-Semitism and the Jewish identity, the one that I mentioned before, which is caused a lot of attention in the last year or so, or a few months. As a Jew, the reclaiming our history from those who blame, shame, and try to erase us. And I think it's kind of an unusual career path. How you have so many stations in your life. Maybe you can tell us a little bit what inspired you to write the second book.
Yeah, no, I realize that it's funny. I grew up like many American Jews, where Judaism for me was like a few kind of boring holidays, some generic values about, don't lie, cheat, steal, help those who are vulnerable. And I just didn't find it very compelling. So I kind of walked away from it. And then in my mid 30s, through a totally bizarre set of circumstances, I wound up taking an introduction to Judaism class at the local Jewish community center. And I was blown away by what I found. And this was like 4,000 years of wisdom about what it means to be human. And it was so much more profound than anything I was seeing in the self-help aisle or the kind of, set of social justice slogans that I saw. And I was like, where has this been all my life? And so I took another intro class. I started studying with rabbis and reading books. And, towards the end of the White House, I just thought like, what if I could write a book for Jews like me, right? Who like look, it not just covering the nuts and bolts how to. There are lots of books that covers that, and not these super esoteric academic books that are kind of a real slog if you're not a really academic person. Where is the book that kind of uncovers the transformative, inspiring wisdom that we as Jews and really everyone could use today? So I wrote that book. Lots of fun, went on a book tour, but the book tour was cut short because of COVID. And I had a lot of time on my hands, and I decided to train, as you mentioned, to be a hospital chaplain. And I was really struck during that training by the word chaplain. Let's just start there. Like, that's a Christian word, but chaplaincy is open to people of all traditions. So that's interesting, right? I began to realize just how much growing up in a Christian country, I had really soaked in Christian language, ideas, values. I really thought in Christian terms. So I always thought like spirituality is that our bodies are degraded and material and kind of gross and bad. And there is this heavenly spiritual realm that is good. And spirituality means escaping this bad body for that good spirit realm. That is in no way a Jewish idea. That is not a central Jewish idea. Like read the Torah, a lot of stuff about our bodies. But I always thought, no, that's just spirituality. Even as a chaplain, I was told prayer is, God, please heal my friend Yair. He's right here. He can hear me praying. I'm making it up spontaneously from my heart just to fit his circumstances, which is beautiful. Great way to pray. Jews can, of course, pray that way if they wish, but I wouldn't say that's a common form of Jewish prayer. But I was told, no, you pray for all patients like that. That is prayer. Okay, not really. That's how Christians pray. So I began to realize like, wow, my ideas about Judaism are shaped by the Christian majority around me. The second thing that led to my second book is that, after the 2021 Israel-Gaza war, I started noticing some very ugly rhetoric about Jews and Zionists in Israel online. And, I'd been really focused on right-wing anti-Semitism, the kind that we saw at the Charlottesville marches, the kind that led to the Tree of Life shooting in Pittsburgh. Like that to me was what anti-Semitism was. But this was coming from the left, which was my side of the house. And I thought, like, wait a second, something is really going wrong here. And then the final thing is, I visited a college campus in 2022 and I spoke to Jewish students at the Hillel. And they kept asking me, like, what did you do about anti-Semitism when you were in college? And I was like, what? Like, I went to college in the 90s. I didn't experience anti-Semitism. What are you talking about? And I realized, like, oh boy, something is going very wrong here. And I began to reflect on my Jewish identity, which for most of my life had been this series of apologies. I'm Jewish, but not that Jewish. Oh, I'm just a cultural Jew. Oh, it just social justice is my Judaism. I'm not like those other Jews, those Jews. Really? Well, what if social justice wasn't my Judaism, but Judaism was my Judaism? What if I wasn't just a cultural Jew, but a really proud, passionate Jewy Jew? Was that a problem? Why was I doing that? And this second book, As a Jew, was really my attempt to understand all of these layers of internalized anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, self-hatred that I think are a result of centuries and centuries of persecution that has very much infiltrated and warped many of our identities as Jews. And I wanted to strip away those layers and really discern them and acknowledge them and understand where they came from so that I could turn back to our tradition with open heart, open eyes, real reverence and curiosity, rather than with the disdain and hatred of those who persecuted us.
Really interesting, this journey that you had. And I think we'll just jump right into the anti-Semitism. And all of us, I think, or many of us, there's hundreds of people on this webinar right now. And I'm sure that all of us have either faced directly anti-Semitism, as we mentioned before. It could be in healthcare, it could be in the newspapers, it could be on social media, it could be from the right, from the left. And for some people, there's this kind of notion that, yeah, well, anti-Semitism is kind of as old as the world. It's some sort of a mystical power or some sort of an eternal force. We just have to live with it. That's just how the universe is, like the law of nature.
Right.
But I want to hear your view based on your book and other comments is a little bit different.
Yeah, it is very different. And I understand why so many people, including so many Jews, think of anti-Semitism that way. It's because for many of us, our anti-Semitism education is Holocaust education. And what we learn is that the Germans lost World War I, blame the Jews. Then there was an economic depression. The Germans blamed the Jews again and then murdered them. And if you ask, well, why the Jews in particular, the answer you would get is because of prejudice and scapegoating. You're like, I don't know, when you're 14, you're like, okay, that makes sense. But if you ask again, yes, I get it, but why the Jews? Why were they the victims of this prejudice and scapegoating? They'd be like, because of prejudice and scapegoating. That's what we're learning in this public school in eighth grade. Just deal with it. That's not the answer to why the Holocaust and why the Jews. To be very clear, the answer to why the Holocaust and why the Jews is because of 2,000 years of Christian anti-Judaism that led to the thinking that led to the Holocaust. And that is not my brilliant idea. That is the brilliant work and idea of centuries of generations of really renowned Christian scholars and of every major Christian denomination. The Christian denominations have all done pretty extraordinary work, particularly the Catholic Church, in acknowledging the role they played in the Holocaust, in accepting blame and accepting responsibility, in really wrestling with their centuries and centuries of anti-Judaism. So I think it's so important to name that. But try teaching that in an American public school, right? We live in a country where if you say, happy holidays instead of Merry Christmas, many people get very upset. So to say that the Holocaust was, caused in large part by centuries of Christian anti-Judaism, is a tough sell in a public school. But it's so important to understand this history because it very much informs how we understand anti-Semitism today. So I want us to understand that, yes, of course, there was pre-Christian anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism. It was, pagans were kind of xenophobes, right? They thought that Jews were strange, didn't worship their gods, ate weird foods, they just had weird habits. But it was really more, I think scholars tend to regard that as a kind of xenophobic prejudice. Christianity came along and theologized it. The New Testament has two groups of Jews fighting with each other. This is all Jews here. But eventually they part ways. Some remain Jews, some become Christians. And unfortunately, a number of early Christian leaders sought to define Christianity against Judaism. There was a very strong anti-Jewish tradition in Christianity that said that Jews are just supernaturally powerful, so powerful and so diabolically depraved, so evil and devilish that they actually killed God's son. They actually got the Roman occupiers to kill God's son, right? And there might not be many of them, but they work behind the scenes in a conspiracy, pulling the puppet strings of power to get people to do their dirty deeds. So these themes of power, depravity, and conspiracy really set down pretty early on in Christianity, and they make their way through the Western world. Now, the Islamic world had its own anti-Jewish tradition and anti-Christian. Was very different. It was that Jews are second-class citizens. They're kind of a protected status. They're better than pagans, but they're weak, pathetic, kind of useless, not central to Muslim tradition at all. They were pretty brutally discriminated against in kind of a Jim Crow way, but Islam did not define itself against Judaism. Unfortunately, in the last recent centuries, through colonization, these Christian ideas about Jews being powerful, depraved, and a conspiracy, they made their way into the Muslim world. And you can now see them very prominently featured in Islamism, in the thought of Hamas and ISIS about the powerful Zionist conspiracy to destroy the world. The Soviets also got in on this action, but again, of course, the Jews were not the enemies of the Soviets. No, no, no. The Soviets loved Jews. It was only Nazis who hated Jews, and the Nazis were the enemies of the Soviets. For the Soviets, it wasn't the Jews that were the problem, it was the Zionists because of their powerful, depraved, conspiratorial ways. You can find that at a college campus near you if you want to explore that more. But this power, depravity, conspiracy set of themes, they've been around for centuries. It's not a mystery. It's not mystical and somehow baked into the universe. This is human beings coming up with ideas. This is history and this is theology. And it is very much what we are wrestling with and continuing to wrestle with today.
Thank you for that. So I think from that, the natural continuation, and bear with me because it's going to be a little bit of a long question, because
Sure.
this is things that we've been hearing from a lot of, friends of mine, colleagues, etc. Is this whole concept of, is anti-Zionism considered anti-Semitism or not? Is this, many people are talking about anti-Semitism being the new, or anti-Zionism being the new form of anti-Semitism. And I think that's kind of I want to get into this question, because the way that many people are seeing it is that sometimes There are people who are saying, well, they're starting. We're not anti-Semites. We are just critical of Bibi and this and the government. And we think that what Israel is doing is the worst crime. And that's why they're so focused on it. And we saw this a lot in the last couple of years. Although I will see that something has changed, in my opinion, and many other people. Because, for example, and many people on the call are aware of what has happened. Just as one example, just a few weeks ago in a high school that is just a few miles from here, that a principal was calling a parent, literally just a few miles from here, and he was calling, and he thought that he hung up, but the voicemail continued recording, and he was talking to a counselor who was in the room and saying, "Oh, these Jews, and Jew camp, and it's all about Jew money," and they were kind of like joking between themselves. He must be a lawyer because he's Jew, and that by itself started like on social media a crazy amount of messages, and some of the messages, including from neighbors here, not Jewish neighborhoods who live not far away from here, on social media say, well, I was always right-winged, I was always a Republican, I was always this, I was always that, I was always supportive of Israel, but now I realize the truth, that Israel is the devil, and the Jews are about money, so he didn't lie. So I think that something is changing, but without a doubt, what we feel of anti-Semitism in the last couple of years, the bulk of it was, oh, we're not anti-Semites, it's just basically criticism of the state and government of Israel. So what are your thoughts about this?
I have many thoughts of this, so this will be a little bit of a long answer to, I think, what is a rightfully long question, because you're right, this is really confusing and complicated. Let's be clear. I'm very critical of the current Israeli government, just as I'm very critical of the current American government. And in that, I am joined by millions of Israelis and millions of Jews, right? Criticizing the government is an Israeli pastime. It's not anti-Semitic, let's be clear. But I want to really step back and say, what is this that we're dealing with? And the only way I can really make it clear, sadly, is by analogy. And so I'm going to ask you if, you were on a college campus and a bunch of students decided they were very critical of the current Chinese government, really didn't like their policies and actions. Fair enough. And the way they decided to express their criticism is by going to their Chinese American classmates and saying to them, you have to reject China entirely. If you visit China to see your family or friends, if you study abroad there, if you speak Chinese, if you say a single good thing about Chinese culture or history, or express any connection to China whatsoever, you're dead to us. We will exclude you from our clubs, we will harass you, we will ostracize you. And now we're going to hold really loud, scary, screaming rallies where we're all masked and we scream, Chinese people equal Nazis, and we don't want no China lovers here. Is that critique of the Chinese government? No, obviously not, right? That's just racism, just bigotry. That is what is happening on college campuses, where this is not a substantive critique of the Israeli government's policy and action. It is a campaign to harass, ostracize, smear, and terrify any Jewish students who have any kind of connection to Israel whatsoever of any kind. That's not critique. So let's be just real clear about what we're dealing with. I also just want to offer a few frameworks that I think will also make this kind of clear. The first one is there is a very big difference between personal anti-Judaism, between like personal social anti-Semitism, which says like, oh, I don't, Jews are dirty and cheap and crass and materialist, and I don't want one to marry my daughter or join my country club. You still see that kind of social, personal prejudice today. But I think what you more commonly see, and this is the work of a scholar named Bernard Harrison, is a kind of political anti-Semitism, which says that the Jews as a collective are the one thing standing in the way of the redemption of the world. The Jews are the one bad thing that is stopping the big, good moral project that the rest of us are involved in. So 2,000 years ago, it was we, the Christians, are Christianizing the Roman Empire. And what is stopping us? The only thing stopping us, these bad Jews who won't convert. Centuries later, we, the communists, are bringing about the brotherhood of man, the revolution, the great, this great social change. Who is stopping us? These capitalist, industrialist Jews who are stymieing the revolution. A couple of centuries later, we're in Nazi Germany. We, the racially pure Aryan Germans, are bringing about the great racially pure Aryan fatherland. Who is stopping us? These bad race-polluting Jews. We see this now today on both the right and the left. On the right, it is we, white Christian Americans, are trying to bring back white Christian civilization. What is stopping us? These globalists who are importing Black and brown immigrants to take the place of white people in America. Okay, I don't know whether that's more racist or more anti-Semitic, but it's a lie, and it is an ugly conspiracy theory called the Great Replacement Theory that Tucker Carlson has made his brother, but that is his Torah, basically. On the left, we have, we the social justice folks are bringing about anti-colonialism and anti-racism. The only thing stopping us, these racist colonialist Zionists. This is very confusing because many people who say these things have Jewish friends, right? They're not social personal prejudice. They don't have social personal prejudice against Jews. They don't think Jews are crass or dirty or cheap, but they have a deep hatred of the Jews. There are even Jews who are promoting this political anti-Semitism, which is why it's confusing, but it is anti-Semitism. The second framework I'll offer is one that Dara Horn explains beautifully in her book, People Love Dead Jews. There is a kind of eliminationist anti-Semitism that says the Jews are bad. There is nothing they can do to be acceptable. We will kill them. That is the Holocaust, pogroms. That is Jackson, Mississippi, burning down a synagogue. There is nothing Jews could do to stop that. There's another kind, though, that is a kind of conversionist anti-Semitism that says, yes, the Jews are bad, but there is something they can do to be saved, and that is they can convert. So centuries ago, it was, okay, Jews, if you convert to Christianity, maybe we won't burn you at the stake. Maybe we'll let you live. Maybe. In my parents' and grandparents' generations, it was convert to being a WASP, a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Change your last name, reject Jewish religion, get a nose job, stop being so, quote, Jewy, whatever that means. Don't talk with your hands, be more restrained. These are all ugly, stupid stereotypes, but it was convert to being a WASP. Today, what I see is that the conversion demand is convert to anti-Zionism, and then you will be okay and acceptable. And you actually see on college campuses Jewish students just like expressing this conversion narrative that sounds like it is out of the 14th century Europe, right? Where it is like growing up, my rabbi and Hebrew school teachers, they told me Israel was good and amazing and a utopia. And then I got to campus and realized, no, it's a genocidal, racist, apartheid, Nazi state. And I had an epiphany. I saw the light, and I took anti-colonialism and anti-racism into my heart, and now I'm an anti-Zionist. Now I am saved. And their classmates are like, yes, now you are saved. And this is so confusing because this kind of anti-Semitism, it often looks like the Jews are willingly rejecting their own Jewishness. It almost looks like it's something they're willingly doing, but it's really not willing. It really is a result of persecution. It's anti-Semitism. The final framework I'll offer is that anti-Semitism gets upgrades. And the reason I think we are so confused today is that we're still on an old upgrade. So what do I mean? You have pre-Christian, pagan anti-Semitism, which is a kind of xenophobia. That's number one. Then Christians come along and upgrade it. They theologize it. It's upgrade number two. And it is always the elite thinking class that does the upgrade. So you have very sophisticated Christian clergymen drawing on centuries of sophisticated theology to say that Jews killed Jesus and they're evil and carnal and the devil. That was what the elite said. So that wasn't bigotry. That was truth. Well, centuries later in modern Europe, no one's going to go around saying Jews killed Jesus, right? That was old-fashioned superstition. They now had science, right? The educated European gentlemen at the university said, no, it's not the Jews' religion that's the problem, it's their race. Science tells us that Jews are racially degraded and perverse and polluting our beautiful fatherland. That was the upgrade. That was 3.0. Today, we have a new upgrade. Today, the elite thinking university-educated class says, no, it's not the Jews' religion. Jews didn't kill Jesus. Nonsense. It's not the Jews' race. We would never say Jews are racially inferior. God forbid. But today, the upgrade, the problem is the Jews' nation. It's Zionism. It's Zionist. It's not the Jews who are the problem. It's the Zionists. Again, it's the elite thinking class. It sounds like truth. It sounds like enlightenment, but it is the same anti-Semitism that we've seen for generations. And the problem is we teach young people about upgrade 3.0, Nazi racial anti-Semitism. We're now on 4.0, and we need to teach people about that. And, to briefly just speak to that kind of anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism, I've been going around saying, I have this whole spiel where I say, I am a Zionist. Let me tell you what that means. What it means is that I believe in Zionism, which is the national independence movement of the Jewish people. I believe in it. I believe that Jews should have a state in their ancestral homeland and should have safety and security, just like Latvians have in Latvia and Japanese people have in Japan, and like I hope Palestinians will have in Palestine one day. And I believe that because we ran the counter experiment for 2,000 years, and the result was millions of murdered Jews. I know what it means to not have a state. It means millions of murdered and assaulted and brutally discriminated against Jews. And I don't want to run that again. And I'm also a Zionist because I know what happened after we had a state, which was that millions of Jews were not murdered. In fact, hundreds of thousands of them fled Arab lands, fled brutal persecution in Arab lands. Instead of being murdered, they went to Israel. 2 million Soviet Jews, instead of being murdered, they went to Israel. 100,000 Ethiopian Jews, instead of being murdered, they went to Israel. Went to Israel. We can do this all day. Lots of countries where that is the story. And so I always say this spiel. And then I started reading the work of a scholar named Adam Lewis Klein, who's been working a lot on anti-Zionism. And I began to really question this spiel because he makes very clear, he's like, this debate of is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism? Is it not? I don't know. He's like, irrelevant. Anti-Zionism is an anti-Jewish hate movement. Anti-Zionists are oftentimes discriminating against, harassing, assaulting Zionist Jews and constructing them as evil, depraved, monstrous in a conspiracy. So, like, does it matter whether it's like classical racial anti-Semitism or like religious Jew? It kind of doesn't matter. It is kind of a hate movement. And he made me really think that, if anyone went to someone who's a member of a historically oppressed minority group and said to that person, whether it's a racial group, an ethnic group, a gender group, a sexuality group, if someone said to them, hey, people in your group are less intelligent than others and also more prone to bad behavior. Okay, no self-respecting member of that minority group would say, no, 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 wait, let me show you studies that show that we're not less smart. And here's a report that says we behave well. Let me engage with the content and have a big debate with you. They would just say that's bigotry. That's a lie. There's no content to engage with. That's just a bigoted, hateful lie. No, thank you. And yet someone comes up to me and says, there is one state on this planet, one country on this planet that we need to eliminate. We need to dissolve. And it's your state. It's the Jewish state. And what do? I want to show them maps and talk about the Peel Commission report of 1937. And I have all these anxious things about this and that. At the end of the day, isn't that just kind of bigotry? And look, in theory, are there people who are anti-Zionist who really want the elimination and destruction of the state of Israel who are not anti-Semites? Sure, there are people who don't believe in nations, so they want every nation destroyed. Okay. I think there are Palestinians who've suffered because of Zionism and they just don't want Israel to exist because they've suffered. Okay. Are they necessarily Jew haters? We can get into the nitty gritty and this and that, but like seeing this clearly, I think pretty much almost all of the anti-Zionism we're seeing today, I do think is anti-Semitism, and I'm really not afraid to say that.
Well, that's a lot. And I think that
I know, it's a lot.
I say some comments back. So first of all, I think
Please.
that I have like a lot of free associations before we move to the next question. But first of all, Zionism, it's something that is different than, or this anti-Zionism. And as you were speaking, flashes of memory came to what happened, for example, in New York recently, I don't know, a few months ago or a year ago, that on the train, there was somebody filming on the subway train, and then a few bullies just came up and said, who's Zionist here? Who's Zionist here? Get up, with so much violence and hatred. And I think that for me, for example, my background, some of you know me, I am half American. My father is American, Jewish since the beginning of the 20th century. And my mother, though, is Israeli. I was raised in Israeli. Hence my funny accent, or my Israeli accent. And I think that for me, just to think about all the things that you said, my grandmother, who just recently died at 98, a few months ago, she survived the Holocaust. She was not wanted in Europe. She was not wanted in Hungary. They sent her to all the camps. They destroyed all of her family in Auschwitz. Somehow she escaped. She tried to come to Israel as the homeland, as you say, of the ancestral homeland for thousands of years, to come there. They didn't let her, the British. She was a refugee here in Italy, eventually, she tried to be a refugee in Brazil, then in Argentina. She tried, and all that time she was felt as an alien, that she doesn't belong. And eventually she met her husband, they moved to Israel. I lived in Israel, I know that it's a wonderful place. Yes, there was problems, but of course there are problems. It's a very challenging place, but the Israeli people are amazing people, creative, smart, funny, friendly. I mean, I'm proud to be an Israeli. And for me and so many Israelis who live, for example, in the United States, these last 2 years have been so hard, to the point that when I'm on the train and I'm embarrassed to talk to my mother in Israel in Hebrew, that God forbid nobody will hear me and judge me for being, God forbid, an Israeli. That has been very, very difficult.
It's so hard. Sorry, go ahead. Because I want to respond to that because it's really right on.
The last thing that I'll say, and I'd love to hear your comments about it, is also when you're about the conversion anti-Semitism. That also hit the spots because in our school district, K to 12, I have two young kids, K to 12, so I go to the board members, the board meetings, and on the board meetings, somehow in the last couple of years, disproportionately, you have all this conversation and people coming and saying how horrible is Israel, 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 and then what I'm thinking about when you're talking about the conversion is this parent who came up maybe a couple of months ago, and of course, the parent started with, as a Jew. And you can imagine how this conversation. As a Jew, I have to say some things. My grandfather came to New York. He was a rabbi in New York. He declared that he was anti-Zionist. He this and that. The worst sin in the history of the 20th century is 1948 Declaration of Israel. Should have never happened. The biggest lie. Israel should not have existed. And I was there. Other people were there, and we were like, it's like you have anti-Semitism, and then you have this. It was like a knife in the heart. So
It is so, I really want to respond to that because it is so painful, right, to hear this. And like, just with all due respect to that person, that's a position of incredible privilege, right? This is someone who's been in this country for two generations, who's had safety and security. And I'm glad, right? I want Jews to be safe and secure. And that's so wonderful. And millions of Jews around the world have not had that privilege, actually. 850,000 Jews from Arab lands, Arab Jews, Mizrahi Jews, who are not white under any, definition of this word, like they were not privileged, right? They didn't have that privilege. They had to flee. I think that just not that kind of, I see this especially in something that I see catching on today is this idea of the diasporist. People say, well, I'm a diasporist. I don't think we should have a state because having a state is very bad and corrupt and it makes us do bad things. I think we should live in diaspora. And look, the truth is, like, we did live in diaspora and we did build beautiful communities. We did have strong, thriving cultures. I don't want to take that away. I do think living in diaspora can be quite lovely. However, they also murdered us by the millions. And to say, oh, that was the good, natural, pure state is to forget the idea that Jews have bodies. We have bodies, and our bodies in our tradition are not considered just meat envelopes for our souls. They are sacred. They are precious. Again, read the Torah, a lot about how we treat our bodies. And so, when I hear this idea that Jewish bodies don't matter, I always think, would you ever go to some other historically oppressed minority group in America and say, you guys did so wonderfully under conditions of brutal oppression. You built thriving institutions and strong families. You were so resilient and strong, and you actually achieved a lot. So let's go back. Let's just take away all those civil rights laws and all that progress because you did so well under oppression. Like, God forbid. I would never say that to someone. So why are Jews saying that to other Jews? Right? We would never tolerate other people's bodies being assaulted and murdered and brutalized. We shouldn't allow our own bodies to be treated that way.
So, Sarah, I have a follow-up question. Basically, we're talking a lot in the last few minutes about anti-Semitism and the current, manifestation of anti-Semitism, which is anti-Zionism. Many people are especially when we hear it from the Jews and from all around us, from the left, from the right, I sometimes feel, it's really hard to fight it. Maybe you can give us some suggestions or tools on what to say when we are in a situation, either personal, social media, just even for ourselves and our thoughts in our minds.
Yes.
How do we deal with this amount of hatred?
Oh my God, yes. So look, I think that the way that the Jewish community traditionally has dealt with it is by saying, okay, we can fight this, right? We can actually change people's minds. We can stop the haters from hating us. And look, I do think there are things we can do. I look at organizations like the ADL who are doing really important work around laws and security. And I really appreciate that work. I think it matters. And there are 16 million of us in the entire world with an M, million. That's like a Chinese city. That's what we are. We're like the fifth largest city in China. There are billions of people who have a very long history of hating us. A lot of this stuff is happening on social media where we are vastly, vastly, vastly outnumbered. And algorithms are shaped by majority rules. They are also shaped by foreign actors seeking to sow dissension and hatred, ginning up anti-Semitism. So the idea that we can fight this, there's a little bit of the illusion of control the idea that we can control things, that we can actually make people not hate us. I certainly think there are some important steps we can take that are being taken by organizations like the ADL and others that I appreciate. But if I'm going to be honest, I think the most important step we can take is to make sure that 16 million Jews know what it means to be a Jew. For most of my life, I had this very just pathetic Jewish identity, which was like, ha ha, Seinfeld, bagels. Oh, I'm kind of anxious. Ha ha. I gotta tell you, if someone comes to you and says Jewish tradition is violent and vengeful with an angry, unloving God, what would I have said? Ha ha, I'm anxious? Really? That would be my answer? Or if they said Israel is a genocidal apartheid Nazi state, again, am I going to tell them about bagels? Like, what am I going to say back? When your Jewish identity is a massive gaping void with a few ethnic jokes rattling around in it, it will be filled by what's around you. It will be. If you don't know the Jewish story, you will believe the stories others around you are telling. And this is actually a phenomenon that the early Zionist thinker Ahad Ha'am wrote a lot about. He wrote about how there's often this general agreement about the Jews that is very negative, right? There was general agreement centuries ago that Jews were killing Christian babies and using their blood to bake into matzah. Horrific, disgusting lie. But Jews back then knew their story. They knew their halakha. They knew Jewish law that prohibited the consumption of blood. So they said, that is nonsense. They knew it was a lie. It wasn't hard. Unfortunately, today, when people are saying that Israel has no right to exist, that Zionists are bloodthirsty monsters who just want to kill Palestinians, that Judaism is an unloving, angry, vengeful tradition, if you don't know any positive, true story about Judaism, you will believe those stories. So I don't know if we can stop billions of people who've hated us for thousands of years, but I do strongly believe that we can get 16 million Jews to know their story, to know. And by the way, that story is so diverse and so complex and so rich. I should really say stories, the millions and millions of Jewish stories. I think we can get 16 million Jews to have a positive Jewish identity so that when the haters come with their lies, we'll be like, oh, no, 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 I know the truth. That's a lie. I really think in a way that is one of the most important things that we can do to fight anti-Semitism.
So I think with that, I'd like to, maybe transition the conversation to something a little bit more positive. And again, it's going to be a little bit of a long question.
Yeah.
And you have, studied and learned and have written about, the Jewish tradition, the Jewish culture. And I'd like to focus a little bit on that because when you're talking about what's beautiful about the 16 million people, one of the things that I'm thinking about is, for example, I'm Jewish, I'm a Zionist, I'm Israeli, but I'm also not very religious. About a mile away from here, there's a huge community that I have many friends of, and when I go there, it's mostly modern Orthodox, of course, concentrated around shuls and communities. And there's something very, very beautiful. I've visited them. I've been there on Saturdays, on Friday nights, and there's something very positive about the community, very special. For example, on a Saturday, you can sit there for lunch. There's kids, everybody's having fun. The doors are always open. Neighbors are coming in and out, dropping something, just having a chat, conversation, walking to the synagogue. There's spiritual leaders. There's something, of course, there's no technology, no digital on Friday and Saturday. It's all basically being mindful with the family and the spirituality and the positive sense of the Jewish community. So I think there's a lot of positive, and maybe you can tell us a little bit more about what you were impressed by in terms of the Jewish heart, the Jewish culture.
Yes. Oh my God. I mean, so much. And I share your love for that. I'm also not, I'm not I'm not traditionally Jewish. I'm not Orthodox, but I love being in really traditional communities on Shabbat, because you're right. It's a palpably different space. And it is like community, it's family, it's people going in and out. Everyone is so deeply present. I mean, this is the Jewish innovation of Shabbat. This idea that we are not slaves, that no one should be treated like a slave, that for one day a week we stop. We cease. Like Shabbat literally, it doesn't mean rest. It means pause or cease or stop. And that is this idea that once you stop and instead of just creating, imposing your will on the world, trying to conquer and dominate, you actually just rest in your own createdness, as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory said, right? You appreciate your own createdness. You appreciate the creation of the people around you, of our earth. It's a very powerful practice. And, I think just like the idea of community and peoplehood, that's unfortunately, I think, something we've a little bit lost sight of in the modern world because we're confused. We think that Judaism is a Protestant style of religion. And the reason that we think that, at least here in America, is because so many of us have roots in Europe. Now, many Jews do not have roots in Europe. Their roots are in Asia and Africa. I really want to be clear about that. But many American Jews have roots in Europe, where in the 19th century, as Jews were gaining the rights of citizens and trying to fit in and assimilate and be part of the broader culture and attend universities and get secular jobs, you know, they had to change what it meant to be a Jew. Before modern times, being a Jew meant you're just a Jew. You weren't like a French person of the Jewish faith. You were a Jew 24/7. You lived in a Jewish community, lived by Jewish law, ate Jewish food, got a Jewish education. Shabbat looked like what you described, right? It's like people going in and out of each other's houses. It was 24/7. Then in modern times in Europe, we became Frenchmen of the Mosaic, as in Moses' persuasion, Frenchmen of the Jewish faith. We kind of made Judaism into a quote religion, but Judaism is not just a religion. I cannot emphasize that strongly enough. Those of you on this Zoom who are Jewish, if you reject every aspect of Jewish religion, you are still a Jew. Nor is Judaism a race. Jews are incredibly diverse. Look around, especially Israel. Very racially diverse, very ethnically diverse. So what are we? Well, for whatever the Ammonites or the Hittites or the Edomites are, it's a category that no longer exists. It's a tribe, a peoplehood, a civilization, a nation. But most of all, it is a family. And if you don't understand that, it kind of leads you on a path to anti-Zionism. Because if you think that Judaism is a Protestant style of religion of social justice and tikkun olam, you might look at the 7 million Jews in Israel and say, well, they don't seem to be practicing my religion of tikkun olam, so forget them, right? We don't have anything in common. But that doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And I get it. If Judaism is just a religion, it's like if some really progressive Christian in America were to look at some very, conservative Pentecostal Christian in Brazil, they wouldn't think they have a lot in common, right? They're not really, it doesn't work. But like the Jews in Israel are not just my co-religionists, they're my family. They're not my fellow practitioners of Jewish religion, they're my mom. And I think once you understand that, we all understand that we have a little bit more of an obligation to our families than to others. That's not bad. That's not, that I think that ethic of proximity, that ethic of family, it's been kind of degraded in the modern world. This idea that everyone around the world should have our same concern as our family, that's not true, right? We are a very small family. We're 16 million people. And I think that ethic of Jewish family, it was ripped away from us in the modern world when we sought to be safe and accepted in Europe. And spoiler alert, as your grandmother well knows, it didn't work. And I think we need to reclaim that.
So I have one more question that has just came up to my mind when you were talking, and it's not going to be a very, it's a little bit of an uncomfortable question, uncomfortable for me as well, is that you said we're only a few million people, like a city in China. It's a very small, and it's really important that we're going to stay and focus on our Jewish identity, culture, etc. But also, like you mentioned, it's a community and it's a family.
Yeah.
And what we have seen more so in the last couple of years, I've felt, and many people have been feeling this as well, especially if they deal with activism and trying to support Israel, is that there is almost a little bit of a pairing of the society, of the Jewish society. So it's not only those people who are JVP who basically announce, no, Israel is not this and not that, and are, clearly anti-Zionist. But even if you see on the discussions, on social media, on the WhatsApp groups, in person, there are probably because these last 2 years have been so painful and we're all so agitated and emotional about the hostages in Israel and the war and the death and what happened in the Nova Festival. It's just so, and the anti-Semitism, it's tearing us apart. So often we see clashes internally. It could be the right versus the left versus the right, the Republicans, the people who support ADL, the people who are saying that ADL are not doing enough, the people who are talking about other organizations that we should, and we see this. People are leaving each other, disconnecting with each other. And I have seen this, I've witnessed this, I felt it on my own flesh. How do we deal with this internal pain? How do we heal ourselves?
Yes. My gosh, I love this question. And I find this so painful because it's just like I see, look, are there extremists on both sides of the Jewish people who I do think are actually problematic, right? People who are really have very on both the left and the right have kind of violent, extreme, dehumanizing ideas that should be criticized, right? But this is a small number on either extreme that I think we rightly should say, hey, that's not okay. That is not okay. That's dehumanizing. That's violent. That's wrong. But there's like a 70% or 8, I don't know what the number is. There is a vast majority that is not extreme, right? That is in in this big middle, grappling with the nuance and the complexity and trying to be humane and also reasonable. These are people like me who say, like, look, I'm an American patriot. I love this country so much. And I'm really critical of the current president. Just like I am a Zionist. I love Israel so much, and I'm really critical of the current government. There's complexity that we can hold. And what I would really like is for those people who are in that reasonable, very large center, let's stop the public attacks and actually take them private, right? We should actually challenge each other privately. There's actually a category of Jewish law that covers this. It's known as tochacha, or rebuke. If you see your sibling, your Jewish sibling, sinning, you're actually supposed to approach them privately, very important, privately, and you're supposed to rebuke them. You're supposed to sort of help them see the error of their ways and try to shift them in a better direction. And you do it kindly, you do it respectfully, you don't shame them. We need more of that. Right? Rather than trashing each other online, I'd really like us to reach out and say, hey, you know what? I don't know what you intended with that comment, but I think you're wrong, and here's why. And can you hear me out? I really would like a lot more tochacha, a lot more really respectful, thoughtful, reasonable critique. And then look, the vast majority from the middle, we can take on not only our external haters, but we can take on the small number of Jews who actually are causing harm, who actually are really extreme and violent and problematic on both extremes of the spectrum. So I think you're right. It's a real problem. And I struggle with it too. I find it so toxic and just so unhelpful. There's so few of us. Let's take the reasonable, vast middle and let's work together.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. We have about 15 minutes left, and there's a lot of questions. I'm going to try to address some of the questions and even merge a few together. We may, so just reminder to put your questions in the Q&A. It's not going to be a hard stop at 2 p.m. Eastern time. We may go a little bit, 10 more minutes or so beyond, but not much more than that. So let me start with a few questions. So the first question is coming from Pennsylvania, from Jill. She's curious to know if you have faced or noticed when you were a speechwriter, when you were mingling with all the White House people, if you have noticed any anti-Semitism or even anti-Zionism specifically, and especially more so because you've worked with the Democrats for a while, have you noticed that even back then from the Progressive Democratic Party? And I'll just merge the question with another question. Let me just see here, is that you are very familiar with the White House corridors and the American media. So how would you stand for or block this discourses led by people like on the right side this time, like the Tuckers of the world and all the things that they've been saying?
Yeah.
So maybe share with us some
Yeah.
experience of your
Yeah.
White House career.
So I was in the White House prior to 2017, and not once, not one single time did I get the slightest whiff of anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism anywhere in that White House. This is really much more of a post-2021 phenomenon. The Obama White House was a very kind of normie, reasonable White House on Israel. And look, maybe you want to yell at me about the Iran deal. Maybe you don't like this or that thing, but the real reality is that, and I would say even up until and including Trump, if you look at the Israel policies of White Houses, they don't shift much. It's like here's the line, and some's here, and some's here, and some's here, and some's here. Obama, the memorandum of understanding he signed for funding Israel was the most money that Israel has ever been funded with in history, right? So I think, there is this tendency, I think, in the Jewish world to be like a 95% is an F, right? Like I think we need to be a little bit more thoughtful and reasonable, because what is coming after Trump, I think is going to be very, very, very different. And, I got to tell you, it really frustrates me to hear people saying, well, it's those people on the other side. They're the anti-Semites. They're the problem. My side, we're great. That's not true. It's just objectively, observably not true. We are seeing on the far left today ugly, hateful, anti-Zionist anti-Semitism. And we're seeing now on the right anti-Zionism. That's the thing that's actually, I think, surprising. I think in a way, the American right, Jews on the right have now had their October 8th moment where, America first has morphed into Israel is bad. This is the Tucker Carlson. Tucker Carlson is an anti-Zionist. He is promoting that ideology. You are now seeing mainstream Republicans coming out against funding for Israel. So I actually think that at this point, the right and the left are in pretty similar places, or at least will be in the next however many years. But this is a newer, the roots of this are very old, right? This has been around for these ideas and ideologies have been around for decades. Let's be clear, they have been around, but I think they were really limited more to the fringes. And now, unfortunately, they've become mainstream on both the right and the left. And I don't know the answer, right? I don't know the answer. I know there are people who think that, okay, Israel has to become independent of American aid. And I feel nervous about that. Our former ambassador, Dan Shapiro, wrote a really excellent piece in The Atlantic, really spelling out why America having less of a connection, less influence on Israel is actually not going to be great for America or Israel or the world. So, again, I think this stuff is on both sides. I really didn't see it in the Obama White House. And I'm guessing that, had there been a Republican White House from 2009 to 2017, those people wouldn't have seen it, right? It's moved from the fringes to the mainstream is much more recent.
Yes, I understand. I mean, it's good to know. I think there was always there, but maybe it's kind of like surfacing and bubbling up in the last few years. Another
Yes.
question from Tamar, and you may not be able to answer it. And she says, everybody's so busy right now, and there's so much to listen to on podcasts and read. And
Yes.
she wanted to know, and she hasn't read your entire recent book. And I think that we're kind of discussing many concepts or many things that you're talking about the book. But she was wondering if you can basically maybe what are the points, the most important points that you're trying to convey in the book to kind of like
Yeah.
sum it up a little bit in a few sentences?
Yeah. I will tell you my most important overarching idea is that our identity as Jews in general, but I would say especially American Jews, has been infiltrated and warped by centuries worth of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism, and that has actually affected how we understand ourselves as Jews. It's distorted how we understand our own tradition. So many of us, very much me included, have all these layers of Jewish self-hatred, shame, misunderstanding, and distortion that are within us that we're not even aware of. And my book is really an effort to point out those layers, to show exactly where they came from. That's the overall point I'll say. The second thing I really want to emphasize this idea that anti-Semitism is not a mystery, nor was it something that started in the mid 20th century in Europe. It is thousands of years old, and that neural groove of power, depravity, and conspiracy with respect to Jews, that has been worn very deep into the Western psyche. And those three themes run through anti-Semitism from thousands of years ago to today. I think that's key. And the third thing is that I want people to really understand the modern anti-Semitism they're seeing. And, we are not equipped to understand it by learning about Nazi racial anti-Semitism from the mid 20th century, because so much of what we are seeing today is it is what people call the Red Green Alliance. It is a combination of Soviet anti-Zionism and Islamist anti-Semitism combining in very ugly ways. And it's also on the right combination of a sort of weird, like that old Christian anti-Judaism of Jews kill Jesus. That's really starting to come back on the right. I did not have that on my bingo card, if I'm being totally honest. That has combined with the American First leading to anti-Zionism, which I did actually have on my bingo card. So we're seeing a lot of really old ideas based in this very old neural groove with these three themes. They are coming and they are manifesting across the political spectrum. So I think those are the key things I would want Jews to understand. And finally, I really want Jews to understand how, because of persecution, we had to erase ourselves. If you look in 19th century Europe, you see so many, this heartbreaking founding of the Reform movement, which was this idea that like, we're going to kind of be like the Protestants. I mean, they didn't say it that way, but how it turned out, it was like they have a church, we have a Jewish church. They have the Old Testament, so do we. We invented it. But the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, that was the beginning of the Jewish textual tradition. It was not the end. That was followed by 2,500 years of Jewish debate, questioning, law, ritual, tradition. There's no Shiva in the Torah. That was developed by later rabbis. So much of Judaism today is a result of that 2,500 years. But because the Christians disdained it, we downplayed it. We said, oh, that's not important. We are prophetic Jews. We are, Old Testament, prophetic Jews. And that happened, that has affected American Judaism. It's also very much affected Israeli Judaism. When I was talking about Europe to a bunch of Israelis, they were like, this happened to us. And it's true. You look at the early Zionist thinkers, and they are incredibly denigrating of Jewish religion, right? It's superstition. These rabbis are getting us killed. We have to leave this behind to found Israel. If you look at the communists and socialists in Eastern Europe, they're doing the same thing, right? Religion is the opiate of the masses. Forget this nonsense. We are for the brotherhood of man and the revolution. This is a trauma that all of us faced where we had to kind of rip the beating heart out of our traditions to save ourselves. And fortunately, now we can reclaim them, right? We actually have now the privilege and the power. We have a state with an army and nuclear weapons, thank God. Even though it feels unsafe, I know I feel unsafe today. I feel scared. But guys, compared to 2,000 years of Jews who had nowhere to go when things went wrong, we really are the luckiest Jews in 2,000 years. And we actually do now have the ability to reclaim these traditions that we had to leave behind.
I think that I have a follow-up question from one of the attendees in Pennsylvania, and it's very relevant to what you're speaking about now. And I think it's an excellent question. So the point is that I can tell you that myself, I was always, again, I'm going to my example of over 2 years ago, maybe before October 7th, I was always proud to talk about my history. And yes, I was in the IDF and I was talking Hebrew proudly. I never had any. And then something happened since October 7th, and it's basically Hashamayim naflu alenu. The sky fell on us. There's anti-Semitism, like you said, from the right. Now, especially that example of that person who was a business owner close to us was like, Israel is Satan, and I'm a Republican, and they're all about the money. And then, of course, the left and the communists or the Soviet anti-Semitism and the Muslim. It's all around us. So that leads to the question is, how do we get our allies or those who are not directly affected by all that hatred to us to care about us? How do we get
Yeah.
allies to care about us and to maybe help us or support us through these very difficult 2 years?
Yeah. So, the research I've seen on how to actually do this, it's actually what the research tells us, and take this for what it's worth, is that when you give people a big jargony lecture about like anti-Zionism and the history and this and that, it actually tends not to work. But when you speak very personally from your own experience about the harm that you're facing, about the fear, about the hurt, when you kind of, talk to the real experience of harm, that can tend to move people. I think there was a commercial run during the Super Bowl that showed a family with like, a swastika painted on the garage. And it was, and people really responded very strongly to that. It was a sense of like, oh, that's wrong. And I would like to see a commercial of, a college student being harassed and assaulted by a bunch of, people screaming at them about Israel. That actually seeing the harm tends to move people more than like political point making or scoring or that kind of stuff. So that's what I understand from the research. How you operationalize that, again, I want to be clear, like we have to remember there's 16 million of us and 8 billion others. And I really want to push back on the Jewish self-flagellation, on the Jewish like, oh, we're screwing it up, we're bad, don't have good PR, it's our fault, if we just did something different it would change. Like, it's not true, right? This idea that we're screwing it up, we're not doing the right thing to fight it, and if we did, it would go away. I don't think that's really true. And I think we need to kind of stop with that and maybe reset expectations a little bit more realistically for what we can actually do.
So we're 3 minutes before time, but we're going to push it 10 more minutes or so because there's a lot of questions. Excellent questions. I don't think we're going to get to all of them, but I'll pop a few more questions. So there's a question from Rosalind who is asking, all this, maybe uneducated hatred from the Jews who are basically the conversion anti-Semitism that you're talking about. But what about those people who are extremely educated or in leadership roles or rabbis or cantors who are like, they're almost carrying the flag of anti-Zionism propaganda? How do we handle this? It's not just like a neighbor or this or that. It's like people who are leaders of entire communities.
Yeah, that is real. And it really scares me and bothers me. And I think that what needs to happen, it's also it's still pretty fringe. Hey, it's a pretty small number. And I'll say there are some fringe voices on the right that I think are equally scary and problematic. And so I don't want to locate this on just one part of the political aisle. We got problems on both extremes. I think that the solution is for that the reasonable folks who are in that big middle, we have to be louder. We have to be louder. I think so many of us, because the extremes are so loud and kind of a little bit threatening and intimidating, we just say, forget it. I don't want to walk into that. That's going to be awful. But I think that we're going to have to push ourselves a little bit, and we're going to have to model how to speak thoughtfully and respectfully. You know, being like anti-Zionists are bad and dumb and ignorant. It's like that is not helpful, right? It's just like that's really not helpful. I think it's more being very clear about like, listen, here's what Zionism is. Here is what the impact of it on people. Here's why I don't think it's right or true. Like that's critique, right? The kind of smearing and blaming and name calling, that's just garbage. It's not going to get us anywhere. So I think it's really up to us who are in that middle, who are kind of standing a little bit behind because we just don't want to. If we are silent, those extreme voices on both sides, they will take up all the space. They just will. And unfortunately, social media will give them all the space. This is the problem. Engaging on social media, I don't know. I think that is a medium designed to flatten complexity. It's a medium designed to gin up hatred and dissension and cruelty and just awful stuff. So like I'm not sure if that's the best place to engage. If you are going to engage there, I would really urge you to choose platforms that are more text-based, that can actually have more text or can have just longer form, more kind of humane, longer form and less kind of soundbite slogan, insult, bumper sticker. I think it's more long form, but I think honestly, it is those of us who are wrestling with the gray in that large middle. I think we need to speak up. And by the way, being in that middle does not mean you don't have strong, clear, powerful opinions. Doesn't mean you're milk toast or kind of wishy-washy. I'm not milk toast or wishy-washy, but I'm very much in that nuanced, complex center, and I think it has to be louder.
I think it's an excellent answer, and I think that you're absolutely right about social media. In fact, not related to anti-Semitism, one of the many people that I work with, including myself, are working on basically figuring out and bringing to the attention the damage that social media is causing us as a society, and especially the children. And we see more and more rules and regulations all over the world, even in multiple states, in terms of in the federal hearing a few days ago about the damage and the harm of social media to the young brains. But that's not the point of this conversation. So I'll move to the next question,
Yeah.
which is relevant because you were mentioning campuses. So Benjamin was asking, can we talk a little bit about the catalyst of institutionalized anti-Semitism in academia that is
Yes.
targeting, Western, so such as the Muslim Brotherhoods or, Qatar is behind all of that. And in fact, the next webinar, which is going to happen, I think tomorrow or the following, maybe the organizers can put the chat, when is the next webinar, but it's going to be an amazing webinar about Iran and what's happening in Iran right now, in Iran, and including multiple experts and Jonathan Shanter. Jonathan Shanter, who is one of the leaders of the FDD, often talks about this institutionalized and what's happening with all the huge amount of money from Qatar that is pushing all this agenda and the propaganda through universities and colleges, and also, as you mentioned, social media.
I mean, all of that is a huge problem. And I want to name, like, look, I'm not an expert on this. So I want to just speak very carefully and generally, but like, I am aware it's now pretty clear that Qatar has just shoveled a tremendous amount, like billions of dollars into US universities, and they are getting their money's worth. And I do think, something that I've heard from a lot of universities is the biggest problems are the faculty, where they are kind of modeling not education, not critical thinking, not nuance or complexity, but they really are modeling activism, indoctrination, a real like dogmatic kind of sort of an ideologue stance, which is the opposite of education, right? Imposing a bunch of viewpoints on young people, whatever those viewpoints are. I don't care what they are. That's not education. There needs to be real critical thinking. And I give Alan Garber, the president of Harvard, a tremendous amount of credit because he has recently said we have a real problem with faculty doing activism instead of education. That is really, I think, the heart of this problem. And academia, I think, has begun to see it has, in recent decades, begun to see its role as activism, as social change, as imposing opinions and shaping young minds into a certain direction. That's not education. Again, that is not education. And so something that gives me hope on college campuses is that you're seeing an increasing awareness of this problem. You're seeing the founding of these centers for civic dialogue and civic discourse. And, I have a friend who works at a university as a professor who's been at the front of this work, and he just says, my students love this. They're ready for this. They're sick of the toxic ideological nonsense. They actually are excited to grapple with complexity and nuance. So I think there's a real opportunity here. And also, I think that Jews and others who care about liberalism and about critical thinking about education should vote with their feet. You don't have to pay $80,000 a year for your child to be abused and not really well educated. You don't. You have a choice, right? We can choose where and our allies can choose people who care about liberalism and real critical thinking and questioning and debate and education. You can choose to go to different schools. And that talks, right? I think that will actually start to shift the narrative, and it already has. I think schools are losing really good, smart students of all backgrounds who just say, I don't want this nonsense. I want a real education. I'm going to go to Vanderbilt. I'm going to go to Emory. I'm going to go to Bama. I'm going to go to these other schools where I can really learn. And I think that's really powerful.
Excellent. We're going to take maybe one or two more questions, but I think that this question, very positive question from Elizabeth. So first of all, she thanks you for a very reasonable, relatable explanation of the suggestion. And her question is, you're obviously a scholar. You've learned so much. I can only imagine how many books you have learned about, the Jewish tradition, etc. But she's trying to ask, Elizabeth is asking, is maybe you can summarize for us two or three of your major learnings from your deep work on Judaism. What are the
Yeah,
things that you want to maybe share with us about the
yeah,
Jewish tradition, the tribe as you define it?
yeah. So it's funny, my second book is really me really doing my deepest learnings on Jewish history, peoplehood, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism. It's very much like what we've all been dealing with for the past not just 2 years, but sadly many centuries and millennia. My first book actually, which is called Here All Along, it is entirely about Jewish tradition. It's about Jewish wisdom, ritual, ethics, spirituality. It is like it's a very joyful, like inspiring book. My second book is a little more of a downer, but if I were to say what are the key takeaways about Judaism, I think the most core beating heart Jewish idea is the idea that we are all created in the image of God. That was the great Jewish innovation in the world. Before Jews came along, like people were kind of like property. You could own them, you could kill them, you could buy and sell them. And we really focused on, you were respected based on whether you were powerful, wealthy. We worshiped pharaohs and emperors and kings and the widow, the orphan, the student. Who cared? Judaism comes along and says, actually, every single human being, not just every Jew, every human being is created in the image of God, which, as Rabbi Yitz Greenberg beautifully explains it, he says like that, and he's drawing on Mishnah and ancient Jewish rabbinical thinking. What it means is that each of us is infinitely worthy, can't put a price on a human life. Each of us is fundamentally unique. There is no one else like us. And we are all equal. No one is better or worse than, and no one is of more or less value than anyone else. And nobody actually believes that on this call. It's a super radical idea because I know everyone on this call, including me, has walked by someone on the street who said, "Hey, can you spare a dollar?" And we've said, "Oh, I'm sorry, not today." Or maybe we've given them the dollar and kept walking, or maybe we've just ignored them. But if that person were a celebrity, a senator, someone famous, you would have stopped, right? We fundamentally think a celebrity is more worthy than someone struggling on the street, is more unique. Like that's how we operate as human beings. And Judaism says, no, 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 no. That person on the street is just as worthy as the most famous celebrity. It's a really radical countercultural idea that if you really operated that way, it would shift our world entirely. I also just think like I think the purpose of Jewish existence is to build a society that is the exact opposite of Egypt, of ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt was a society where you worshiped the pharaoh, where might made right, where power was privilege. If you were powerful, you could do whatever you want. Judaism says, no, 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 the exact opposite, right? We're not going to sit around worshiping pharaohs. We're going to really care about the widow, the orphan, the stranger, the poor. It's a very different understanding of what matters, of values, of power. Like I will say that like read the Torah. It's basically a polemic. It's an argument against the oppressive and violent and dehumanizing ways of ancient Egypt, Babylonia, Mesopotamia. This is a really radical tradition of protest. So I think those ideas, those radical countercultural ideas are so critically important. And I'll tell you, I see them in just a few ways today. Number one, we're a society that just is horrified by death, illness, aging, grief, mourning. We want nothing to do with it, right? We don't like hospitals. We don't like funerals. It's like, oh, mourners, make us uncomfortable. Send some flowers, send a text. Let's run away from that. Judaism says, no, 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 you run right to that. If someone is sick, you get your body to their bedside. if someone has lost a loved one and is grieving, you get your body to that Shiva, to that funeral, and you are radically present with them in that thin space, that liminal space where the boundaries between heaven and earth and life and death have thinned out. We say you have to be radically close, present with that person and hold them in loving community. So countercultural. And I'll give one more countercultural piece of wisdom. Look, so much of our discourse today is I have my one truth and I'm going to scream it from the hilltops, and everyone who disagrees with me is evil and bad. That is the most un-Jewish approach humanly possible. Jewish tradition operates in polarities. Our rabbis from the beginning are always wrestling with opposing truths. Our Torah, it holds opposing truths. Our Torah tells us love the stranger, love the non-Jew, the non-Israelite, love them, welcome them, treat them well. And it also says, remember Amalek, remember the Amalekites, the enemy tribe of non-Israelites who attacked the Israelites from behind. It is saying love the stranger, and also remember some strangers want to kill you. So be compassionate, be open-hearted, and don't be naive. You have to hold both truths. And, I think that countercultural wisdom, that radical take on what it is to be human, I think those are really the central beating heart ideas of Judaism.
What a beautiful way to end this fascinating webinar, and your insights are so powerful, and I think that it's absolutely worth reading the books that you wrote, especially both of them actually, but the first one that talks so much about the positive Jewish tradition. And I wanted to thank everybody here that joined us. The recording will be available. I also wanted to apologize that we did not get to all of the questions. We could take more questions and more conversation about these topics for another hour, 2 hours. But at this point, we do need to end. The recording will be available. And then the last thing, thank you so much, Sarah, for joining us and for talking to us and for sharing these insights with us. And it was an amazing conversation. And for everybody, those who I just I mentioned in a couple of days on Tuesday, stay tuned to the very interesting, because there's a lot of things that are happening in Iran now. Nobody really knows, but there are some people who know better than others who are really experts, and I would suggest joining it. Sarah, are there any last words that you want to share with us? And thank you again.
I want to share with you the first words that traditional Jews say upon waking up, which is Moda or Moda Ani, grateful am I, right? We express gratitude for our very existence. So, I mean, really, Yair, thank you for such a great conversation. Thank you to this organization for the extraordinary work you're doing. And thank you to all of you for being here today and supporting that work.
Toda rabba, everybody, and Shavua Tov. Have a good week.
Bye.